Do you ever have questions about your cookies or your icing and you just don't know where to find the answers? I thought I'd go over my most common questions that I get asked about icing and cookies. So, one of the most common ones I get is about consistencies. Do I use 1-2 consistencies? Do I use like seconds to count my icing? How do I get my icing to flow nicely? So everybody does it differently. I, however, do 2 consistencies, which means I have a thicker icing, which I call my outline because I use it for my outline. And I have a flood consistency, which is a looser icing, which means there's a little bit more water in that icing. And that's the icing that I fill my cookies with. Now, my outline also serves as my detail icing. So you can see in some of my videos here where I do little squiggles and then I do outlines on top or on the details. Those are all my outline consistency, my thicker ones, so that keeps all those details in. Flood icing is the one that melts nicely together and gives you that nice, smooth cookie look. And I always get asked, do I share my recipes? I do. I share my icing recipe as well as my cookie recipe, and you can find everything on my channel, including the recipes and detailed instructions on how to make them. Another very, very common question I get a lot is, why do I put little squiggles on top of my cookies and in certain areas, but not in all? So those squiggles are to prevent craters. Now, craters are basically little indents that happen in the icing as it dries. So at first you don't see them right away. Your cookie looks perfect. And then a couple hours later, all of a sudden you might have a little hole in your icing, or you might have an indent where the icing actually caved in. This normally only happens in smaller areas or narrow parts of your cookie. So anytime I think, this looks a little bit narrow or it looks a little bit small, I usually put a squiggle and then I'll flood right on top. And I also get asked, do I let it dry when I do the squiggle and then do I flood it with my icing? And I don't let it dry. I personally don't like to let it dry because sometimes when I'm flooding on top, I might hit it with my scribe when I'm smoothing the icing out, or I might hit it with the tip of my piping bag, and then the hard part of the icing when it's dry breaks off and it kind of floats around. So I prefer to just pipe it right on top, and that kind of supports the icing from caving in on itself. Another way to help prevent craters is also to dry your cookies in front of a fan, just blowing lightly. You don't want it too hard, or you can use a dehydrator in a very low heat setting. Some people like to use their oven on the lowest temperature with the oven door cracked open a little bit. I personally don't like to do that because you have to be very careful because it does get a little bit warm. But those are some ideas. Make sure there's airflow around your cookies to let the icing dry. If your icing is still tacky and it hasn't dried or it doesn't look like it's drying after a few hours, it needs about 6 to 8 hours to fully dry, I would say, unless you're in a humid area. It may take a little bit longer. But if your icing is drying kind of wrinkly or has sort of waves in it, or it's not really drying to the touch, it could be a few things. One thing is you may have overbeaten your icing. So when you're mixing it together, you mix it on too high of a speed for too long. This overmixing causes a lot of air bubbles, and then it doesn't really dry properly. Another thing is you may have some grease in your bowls or on your beaters when you made your icing. Royal icing does not mix well with any grease. So if you're having problems, you can always wipe your bowls and your beater with a little bit of vinegar to get all that grease off. Another thing is if you've covered your cookies before they're fully dry, they won't dry properly. They will not harden. The icing will not get dry and without airflow. So that's why it's really important to make sure you leave your cookies uncovered for as long as you can. If you can do it overnight, even better, and they'll be fully dry in the morning. If you've seen how I make my icing, I do like to flavor my icing with butter emulsion and vanilla. Those are my 2 kind of go-to standard icing flavors that I combine that I love together. And a lot of people ask me if they don't have butter emulsion or they can only find the vanilla butter one, is that okay to use? And that's perfectly fine to use. You can play around with the flavorings a bit. And if you only have vanilla butter, that's okay. You can use that with vanilla as well, or you can just use that specifically if you want to put almond extract, marshmallow extract, lemon, whatever you'd like. You can mix it. The flavor is very up to you. And so it doesn't have to be specifically what I say my flavoring. You just have to go roughly with what amounts I say in my recipe, and it will work out great. You can try different things or separate your icing and try a little bit different ones to see what you like the most. But those are kind of the most popular ones that people love. And a lot of times I get asked, how many cookies can I decorate with my recipe? So this really depends on how much surface area you have on your cookie. It also depends on how many details you're doing. How many layers? Do you have several layers of icing going on your cookie? Are you using it, for a lot of different colors? Because when you color more colors, you might have a little bit of extra left over of each color because you don't want to run out of your colors. So you usually want to make a little bit extra than you think you might need. So sometimes I find the more colors I make, the less icing that I have to use for the cookies. Or if I have like a simpler cookie and I'm only making a few colors, I can probably decorate a lot more. But surface area is a really big one. So if I have a large surface area or I'm doing a lot of details and kind of layers on my cookie, it takes a lot more icing, where if I'm doing a lot smaller cookies, then my icing goes a lot further. I would say on average, it does about 3 to 4 dozen cookies with some leftover. But I've done way more as well when I've done like crosses for a communion set, because the crosses were very narrow, so it didn't take much icing. But then I've also done only about 20 cookies as well when I was doing really large paint your own cookies. So it really depends on how much. And also people ask, and then what if you have leftovers? What can you do with the leftovers? Well, I usually put all my piping bags, I will kind of roll up or fold up the tips and push the icing as far up possible. And then I will put them in Ziploc bags, usually the big freezer ones, and I'll throw them in my freezer. When I take them out the next time, they defrost after a couple hours, and then I'll make some fresh icing with those colors. Comes in handy a lot with red and black, because when you add icing to that, you don't have to add too much gel color to get those colors again. And another thing I get asked very often is, what do I do with my piping bags when I'm not decorating, or I'm kind of decorating with one color? What do I do with the rest? So next to me, I usually have damp paper towels, and I kind of have them open up, and I put my piping bags tips in the middle of the paper towel, and then I will fold the paper towel on top of it. So the paper towel is kind of underneath the tip and on top. And then I will squish the tips like of my flood icing just so they don't leak out. But if it does, my paper towel is kind of there to catch the mess. And then I also have somewhere to kind of wipe off my scribe when I'm using my scribe on different colors. I'll wipe it in between just to get it nice and clean because I don't want the colors to mix. A lot of people ask too, is the icing dry hard? Is it like crunchy? Is it hard to bite into? My recipe adds corn syrup to the icing, so it does have a softer bite. It dries hard enough so you can put them in bags, you can put them in boxes, you can kind of transport them very easily. They won't ruin very, easily if you touch them or anything, or if you handle them in the bags. However, when you go to bite it, it doesn't have that kind of crunch in it. It has a sort of softer bite. So it's not rock hard, but it's not, soft enough that you're going to mess them up if you kind of handle them. And then a lot of people ask how thick I roll my cookies. So I do about, like a 3/8 kind of thickness. That's 3/8 of an inch. It kind of varies. Before I got a rolling pin with guides in it, I would sort of do it by eye or hand and feel kind of how thick they were. So they were all roughly, give or take. Some people like thinner cookies, some people like thicker. I do like to use kind of a little bit of a thicker cookie, just because when you're icing them and you're picking them up and moving them to the dehydrator or kind of somewhere else, it's easier to handle them without getting your fingers in the icing and messing up your flood. But also some people like really thick ones. Some people prefer thinner ones. So it really is your preference. You can play around with it and see what you like. And if you're selling cookies, it's kind of something to think about. How much dough is going into your cookies? If you find your dough isn't going very far because you're cutting your cookies really thick, is it worth cutting them down a little bit thinner? That way you can get more cookies out of your batch. Another really common question I get is, what are the colors I like to use for my icing? I don't really have a preferred brand. I kind of get whatever I have easiest access to or what's available, sometimes for shipping quickly or what's the best deal. I used to really love AmeriColor. They had some great colors. Their super black was great. They had a Christmas red and a red that I loved for a bright red, but not always easy to find lately. So I've kind of switched over to Chef Master, and so I have a combination of those on hand all the time. And so Chef Master is a little bit easier to get a hold of. I'm in Canada, so I don't get all the shipments and everything as easy as maybe some people in the States. I've tried some other colors, some powder colors as well. and kind of some different odd ones, but I really like just the gel colors. I find they work really well and they're easy to clean up, and they work really well and they're easy to use. I hope this video answered a lot of your questions. If you have any more, leave them in the comments for me and let me know. Hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. Happy baking!